If you hadn't been outside in 12 days, you'd probably think that's a pretty long time, right? Since I work from home, there's times I don't go outside between grocery shopping trips on Sundays, but almost 2 weeks? That's a long time not to breathe in any fresh air. So what if you hadn't been outside for 30 years? That's like an insanely long time. And unless you're part of a horror movie or a true crime doc, probably inconceivable. Okay, one more for you. What if you hadn't been outside for over 31,710 years? You probably can't even fathom how long that is, given it's over 317 lifetimes of ours. And that's just how unfathomable $1 trillion is. See, $1 million is equivalent to 12 days. $1 billion is like 30 years. And then $1 trillion, or 1 million millions, is like 31,710 years. Now get this. Last year, the world hit over $305 trillion in debt. I'm not even gonna try and figure out how many years that is, because I think we can just stick to saying it's a lot. If you're asking yourself, how is the world in debt? And if the entire world's in this insane debt, how does that make sense, and how would we ever get out of it? And who gives the world money? Then you're not alone. Because money isn't a physical good, it's just this concept that we give value to, topics like this can start to become really hard to visualize, but we're gonna paint the picture for you. Let's start on the national level here and talk about countrywide debt. When we talk about a country's debt, we're probably looking specifically at the government. And if we simplify the government's budget, there's really just two things to look at: how much the government spends and how much it makes. The main way a government makes money from its own country is taxes. And if the government spends more money than it brings in taxes, then there's gonna be a budget deficit, and they'll have to borrow money from somewhere, I'll cover that in a second, in order to pay off what they didn't cover. On the opposite end, if a government spends less money than the amount of taxes they collect, then they have a budget surplus, and they actually have some extra money to pay off some of the debt that they have. And yes, we're assuming that there's always debt here because there is. Okay, so I mentioned that the government borrows money from somewhere. One way that countries like Canada and the US will borrow money is by creating something called government bonds that other governments, banks, private companies, and individual people can buy. You know how you've probably seen that you can literally invest in government bonds? That's this. The government takes your money as a loan, then they use it to pay for all of their spending that the taxes doesn't cover, and then they'll pay it back to you with a little bit of interest and at a set time. So you could literally be someone who's loaning the government money, just on a much smaller scale than other big companies would be doing. Okay, but that's just national debt. Global debt, so that $305 trillion number, that doesn't just include the government and public debt. It accounts for all debt on Earth. So that's private, public, and household debt. So if you personally have any debt yourself, that's included in this number. And every country contributes a different amount of debt to the global pileup, Japan being the #1 contributor with a debt ratio of 257%. Now, a debt ratio is basically just how much total debt a country has compared to its GDP, or how much the country produces. It's like calculating their output or how much they do to help boost the global economy. In that sense, a higher percentage would sound bad because they're doing more borrowing than contributing, but more on that later. So big questions to ask here is, who's lending all this money out, and can all countries borrow equally?
To answer question number one, there's a few different places that lend money. So we have other countries' governments, and again, private companies, and we have banks both in your country and other countries. So we can't look at it like who's lending the entire world money. It's more like which countries are sending other countries money. It's like this big web of debts growing and lending and borrowing happening all around the world. One of the biggest lenders in the world is China, and over the past few decades, they've started to lend a lot of money specifically to developing countries. See, for developed countries, like let's use Canada as an example since that's where we're from, a lot of borrowing can come from other countries' governments or their own banks, because they have this globally recognized strong financial system, and other countries just trust that Canada will pay back their debts. It's kind of like how it is for us as individual people. If you have a higher credit score, and especially if you have a higher income, then you can borrow more money. Countries are very similar in that way. The better off you are and the richer you are, the more money you can borrow. So a lot of developing countries really struggle to get other countries to lend to them, and this is where China has seen how they can use this to their advantage. They basically started swooping in and lending to countries like Djibouti, Angola, Congo, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, generally countries that are in the South Asia and Africa region. One of the biggest examples that I know of personally is the railroad that China started building in Kenya, and it's a part of their new Silk Road project, whose goal is to finance the building of ports, railroads, and other infrastructure globally. These are some of the countries that owe a lot of money in debt to China for them helping out and building some of these different projects, like the railroad.
And it's a lot of countries that are in the developing category that owe money to China. The top top 50 developing countries that borrow the most money owe 15% of their GDP to them alone. And the reason for that isn't because they're borrowing a lot of money, even though it's hard to say that billions of dollars isn't a lot of money, but it's not relative to the trillions of dollars that other countries are borrowing. Instead, it's that they're being charged these really high interest rates because they're higher risk. Again, just like individual people, if there's a higher risk that you could not pay back the money, then you're charged more interest to borrow, creating this really dangerous loop that's kind of like a trap that becomes hard to get out of. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, let's look at the United States here for a second and pick on them for a bit. The debt ratio there is 133%. That means that if their economy is worth $1 trillion, but they borrowed $1.33 trillion, they're borrowing more than they're worth, and therefore their debt ratio is over 100%. And here's the thing, the average GDP to debt ratio in developed countries is 110%, so they're borrowing more than they're producing. In developing countries, it's only 66%. But again, it's because they can barely borrow any money because it's hard to get others to lend to them. See, countries want to take on debt because in theory, you take on debt so that you can use it to build things or spend in other strategic ways that'll help your country produce more in the future. Again, let's look at Dennis as an example here. He took out student loans so that he could go to school. Now, that debt was worth it for him because he ended up going there, getting a degree, getting a job with a higher salary, and then ultimately paying off that debt and still having a higher salary and more money than he would have if he never took on the debt in the first place. Now, there's a whole other conversation to be had on whether it's actually worth it to take on that debt, but we're gonna stick to the basics for today. Now, for countries, it's the same thing. You take on debt now for more money and output in the future. So for developing countries that aren't able to take on as much debt, they aren't able to get the benefits borrowing money brings, like more home-developed infrastructure projects and things like that. Instead, they borrow less and get these huge high interest payments. So they have money to pay back, but less money created to pay it back. This really causes that whole self-fulfilling prophecy to come true and countries to default, like last year when Sri Lanka was surely struggling with its debt crisis. When a country really needs to pay back its debts, it means that it can't afford to pay for other things that help the people in their country, like healthcare, energy, and education. So entire power grids shut down and hospitals lose funding. It becomes this balancing game that's really lose-lose both at home and globally.
And here's where the US and the US dollar being the strongest currency in the world really comes back to benefit them again. So right now, the US dollar is really strong, which means that other countries are struggling. Here's how that works. So other countries' money is valued against the US dollar, right? If that's the case, then let's say that $1 US is worth $100 in another country's currency. So if they want to borrow $1 US, then they get $100 in their own currency and they pay interest on top of that. Now let's say that the US dollar grows in value, so that $1 US is now worth $2 US, and that $100 is now worth $200, but you still only have $100. So that other country owes $200 in their currency and even more interest on top of that, but they still only have that original 100. And that's how other countries around the world end up owing even more money. They use USD because that's what gets other countries to lend to them, but it still ends up hurting them later on. So again, countries like Japan might have the highest debt ratios, but because almost half of their debt comes from their own domestic banks and they don't have the highest interest rates, their position isn't that bad. It's countries that have lower ratios that are a higher risk of defaulting. And there are times where the debt levels get really high for the richer countries too, kind of like the debt ceiling conversation that's happening in the US right now. Their debt ceiling is currently at $31.4 trillion, and they hit that 2 weeks ago. And yes, that means that the US owes $31 trillion in debt. The high level explanation is that they're borrowing too much and they'll likely either decrease spending on public programs or they'll increase how much they're allowed to borrow. Overall, global debt would be really hard to get rid of. And I mean, sure, certain countries like the US could in theory pay it all off, but we did read this one article that talked about how they probably wouldn't fully pay it off. But the whole world paying it off likely wouldn't happen because of all these systems that trap certain countries into this downward spiral. If you want to hear more about how the US became so strong in the first place, check out this video next, and we'll see you next week. Y'all already know the vibes. We will be back with another video, of course, and yeah, see you next week. Let's go.